I recently faced my own worst nightmare. The HOA president just built 20 rental cabins on my land and told me to get lost. And her excuse? She said they had town approval and that I should go talk to them. Funny thing is, the only thing tested that day was my patience. But let me start from the beginning. My truck, a 10-year-old Ford with more dents than a demolition derby winner, whined in low gear as it clawed its way up the final stretch of gravel road. This was the part one always loved: pine air, cold and clean. Grandpa carved this road and left me 300 acres. I'd been gone 6 months on a big job, but the job was done. The check had cleared, and all I wanted was the creak of the old A-frame cabin's porch swing and the view of the valley turning gold in the sunset. I rounded the last bend, the one that opened up to the main clearing where the cabin should have been. I hit the brakes. The truck fishtailed a little on the loose gravel. It wasn't a clearing anymore. It was a nightmare of raw lumber, Tyvek wrap, and mud-caked machinery and cabins. At least 20 of them, maybe more, crammed together like cheap toys in a box. They were perched on the edge of the ridge, stealing the view that had belonged to my family for 100 years. A fancy, laser-cut wooden sign was planted by the road. It read, Sterling Ridge Estates, an exclusive mountain community. My stomach turned. Sterling. I knew that name. Victoria Sterling, president of the Homeowners Association down in the Valley, a woman who treated building codes like suggestions and people like obstacles. But what was she doing on my land? In the middle of the road, blocking my way, stood a man. He wore a police-style uniform straight from a Halloween store, navy shirt, a cap that read police, and a tin badge. The details were wrong. It was a size too small, the fabric straining at his gut, the pants riding high on his boots. He held up a hand, palm out, like a traffic cop in a movie. I put the truck in park, the engine rumbling a low growl that matched the one in my chest. I'm Ethan Hayes. I run a construction company. I spend my days arguing with architects, placating inspectors, and making sure my guys don't do anything that'll get us sued or killed. I'm calm. I'm methodical. But looking at those cheap, ugly cabins squatting on my grandpa's land, calm was the last thing I felt. I rolled down the window. The pine-scented air was tainted with the stink of fresh-cut lumber and diesel fumes. Can I help you? I asked. My voice was flat. The guard puffed out his chest. Private property, sir. You'll have to turn around. He was trying for authoritative, but it came out squeaky. Funny, I said, leaning my arm on the window frame. I own this private property. All of it. He smirked. A greasy, unpleasant expression. Not according to my boss. This is Sterling Ridge now. You need to leave. I looked past him at the cabins. The workmanship was garbage. I could see it from 50 yards away. The deck footings were just precast blocks sitting on ungraded dirt. The propane tanks were clustered together, way too close to the structure, a clear violation of NFPA 58. The whole setup was a fast buck fire trap. My gaze settled back on the guard. I took in the details. The badge on his chest wasn't a real county sheriff's star. It was a cheap, six-pointed tin thing. The patch read, Sterling Security, in ugly gold thread. He was a fake, a scarecrow. Your boss is Victoria Sterling? I asked. That's right. And she doesn't like trespassers. I gave him a slow, deliberate smile. Well, you tell Victoria that Ethan Hayes is here. And since I'm the one who owns this mountain, that makes her the trespasser. His smirk faltered. He wasn't prepared for someone to push back. His hand drifted down to the bulky object on his hip. It wasn't a real firearm. It looked like a taser, the civilian model. He was all show. I'm not going to tell you again, he said, his voice straining. Turn the truck around. I didn't move. I just watched him. I've dealt with union standoffs and angry subcontractors waving wrenches. This guy was a puppy. A loud, badly dressed puppy. Here's the thing, I said, keeping my tone conversational. I know the sheriff in this county. Sheriff Brody. Known him for 20 years. He's a good man, by the book. And I know for a fact he'd be very interested to learn that someone is up here on a private road wearing a knockoff badge and impersonating a peace officer. That's a felony, you know. The color drained from the guard's face. His hand dropped from the taser. He swallowed hard. I am just security. You're blocking access to my private road, dressed like a cop, and making threats. That's a whole checklist for Sheriff Brody. I reached for my phone on the dashboard. Let's just give him a call. He can sort this out. I'm sure he'd love a drive up the mountain on such a nice day. The guard, whose name tag read Gary in big block letters, started to sweat. He looked back over his shoulder toward the biggest of the cabins, as if hoping for instructions. None came. He was on his own. Look, man, there's no need for that, he stammered. I'm just doing my job. Your job, I repeated slowly, involves breaking several state and federal laws. My job involves building things to code. Right now, I'm feeling a real strong urge to see some rules enforced. I punched the screen on my phone. I didn't even have to look up the number. Sheriff Brody's direct line was in my favorites. The phone rang once, twice. Gary, the security guard, looked like he was about to be sick. He took a step back from my truck, then another. He was trying to decide whether to run or to stand his ground. His training clearly hadn't covered this. On the third ring, a calm, familiar voice answered. Brody here. Sheriff, I said, my eyes locked on Gary. It's Ethan Hayes. I've got a situation up on my grandpa's old ridge. He said he was on his way. Sheriff Brody's cruiser, a dusty but well-maintained Crown Victoria, appeared at the bend a few minutes later, its lights flashing but siren off. Brody was a man carved from the same mountain granite as my grandpa. He was tall, lean, and had a face that looked like it had been staring into the sun for 60 years. He didn't say much, but when he did, people listened. He unfolded himself from the car, adjusted his belt, and walked toward my truck with a steady, unhurried pace. His eyes swept over the scene. My Ford, the ridiculous Sterling Ridge sign, the terrified security guard, and the 20 ugly cabins polluting the skyline. He stopped beside my window, his expression unreadable. Ethan, he said, his voice a low gravel. Been a while. Heard you were working out of state. Finished up last week, I said. Came up for some peace and quiet. Found this instead. Brody nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on Gary, who was now trying to look invisible next to a pine tree. Who's your friend? He calls himself security, I said. He was dressed like a police officer until I mentioned your name. Brody's eyes narrowed slightly. He walked over to Gary. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Son, let me see your identification and any permit you have to operate as a security professional in this county. Gary fumbled for his wallet, his hands shaking. He produced a driver's license and a flimsy-looking card from some online security course. Brody examined them for a moment, then handed them back. Do you have a state security guard license? It sits for my own protection, Gary stammered. That's not what I asked. Brody's voice was like ice. Are you licensed to work security on this site? No, sir. And this badge, Brody continued, gesturing to the tin star on Gary's chest. Where did you get that? It came with the uniform. Take it off. Gary complied, his fingers fumbling with the pin. Brody took the badge, looked at it with disgust, and slipped it into his pocket. Just then, a golf cart came zipping down the dirt track from the main cabin. At the wheel was Victoria Sterling. She was exactly as I remembered her from the HOA meetings. Perfect blonde hair, an expensive outdoor vest, and a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. She looked like she belonged on a magazine cover, not a muddy construction site. She pulled up and hopped out, radiating an aura of absolute, unshakable authority. Sheriff Brody, she said, her voice smooth as polished marble. Is there a problem here? Brody turned to face her. He didn't smile. Afternoon, Victoria. This man, he gestured to me, said he owns this land. And this fella, he nodded at the deflated Gary, was impersonating an officer and illegally blocking access. Victoria's smile tightened. She looked at me, her eyes cold and dismissive. Hayes, I should have known. This is a misunderstanding. This is my property now. I have the deed. It's all perfectly legal. She held out a folded piece of paper. It was a copy of a grant deed. Brody took it, but didn't look at it. He handed it to me. I unfolded it. My grandpa's name was on it, a shaky signature that looked nothing like his real one. The buyer was a corporation I'd never heard of with an address that traced back to a P.O. box. A quick search tied that P.O. box to Victoria Sterling, and the sale date was 2 days after my grandpa's funeral. A cold fury, clean and sharp, cut through me. This is a joke, I said, my voice dangerously quiet. My grandpa would never have sold this land, especially not to you. Victoria laughed, a short, sharp sound with no humor in it. People get old, Ethan. They get sentimental. They also get practical. He got a very fair price. He was dead, I said, locking eyes with her. He died 3 months ago. You filed this deed 2 days after we buried him. 2 days after? Brody said. The air grew still. Brody's face was a stone mask. Victoria didn't even blink. The deal was finalized before he passed, she said smoothly. The filing was just a formality, a clerical delay. It was a lie. A bald-faced, outrageous lie. I could feel it in my bones. My grandpa loved this ridge more than anything. He'd have sooner cut off his own arm than sell it. I handed the paper back to Brody. Sheriff, this is a forgery. Brody looked from me to Victoria. His job was to enforce the law, not to settle civil disputes. He knew it, and she knew it. This is a civil matter, Ethan, he said, his tone apologetic. You'll need to take it up with a judge. I can't remove Mrs. Sterling based on your word against her paperwork. Victoria's smile was triumphant. Thank you, Sheriff. Now, if you'll just have Mr. Hayes remove his vehicle from my road. I'm not done yet. Victoria, Brody said, cutting her off. He turned back to the trembling security guard. As for you, Gary, impersonating an officer is a felony, combined with unlicensed security work and an illegal road blockade. You're coming with me. He pulled out a pair of handcuffs. Gary's face went white. What? But Mrs. Sterling hired me. Victoria's face went rigid. She shot Gary a look that could curdle milk. He was an independent contractor. His actions are his own responsibility. She turned her back on him completely cold, utterly ruthless. As Brody cuffed a blubbering Gary and led him to the cruiser, I stared at Victoria Sterling. She stood there, the queen of her stolen castle, not a flicker of remorse on her face. She had taken my family's legacy and turned it into a cheap, soulless cash grab. Brody paused by my window before he got in his car. Get a good lawyer, Ethan, he said, his voice low. A real shark. Don't try to handle this yourself. He got in his car and drove away, leaving me alone on the road with the woman who had stolen my past. She gave me one last victorious smirk before turning and getting back in her golf cart, disappearing toward her fraudulent kingdom. I watched her go, the engine of my truck still rumbling. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows from the ugly, identical cabins. It was a deliberate, calculated act of theft. And standing there with the cold mountain air on my face and a fire in my gut, I realized this was no longer just about land. This was a war. The first call I made wasn't to a lawyer. It was to my Uncle Walt. He was my grandpa's younger brother, a retired mechanic who lived down in the flatlands and possessed a finely tuned detector for nonsense. I laid out the whole story. The gate, the fake cop, Victoria Sterling, and the forged deed. He listened patiently, the only sound on his end the occasional clink of a wrench against something metal. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Well, kid, he finally said, his voice raspy. Your grandpa always said that woman had the morals of a rattlesnake. Sounds like he was being too kind. What are you going to do? I'm going to fight, I said. Sheriff Brody told me to get a shark. Good advice, Uncle Walt said. But remember, sharks get hungry. You're the one who's got to steer him. You know how to build things, Ethan. You know how to take them apart, too. This is just another crooked foundation. Find the cracks. His words settled something in me. He was right. This wasn't some abstract legal battle. It was a structure, a shoddily built one. And I knew how to read the blueprints of a scam. The next morning, I was sitting in the office of Marco Bianchi. The place wasn't fancy. It was a small, second-floor walk-up over a bakery, and the air smelled faintly of yeast and old paper. Marco matched his office. He wasn't a slick downtown lawyer in a $1,000 suit. He wore a rumpled tweed jacket, had a beard that was more salt than pepper, and looked at me over a pair of half-moon glasses with eyes that were sharp and intelligent. He'd been recommended as a guy who specialized in property and estate law with a reputation for being a bulldog. He listened to my story without interruption, making notes on a yellow legal pad. When I got to the part about the deed being filed after the funeral, he stopped writing and looked up. 2 days after, he asked, his voice a low growl. Yes, I confirmed. She claimed it was a clerical delay. Marco snorted. Clerical delay is my new favorite term for felony fraud. Let's go for a walk. Our walk took us 2 blocks down to the county recorder's office. It was a grand old building with marble floors and echoing hallways. Marco seemed to know everyone, nodding at clerks and bailiffs as we passed. He led me to a counter where a woman with sharp eyes and an impossibly neat bun was stamping a mountain of documents. Marilyn, Marco said with a warm smile. You're looking lovely as ever. The woman, Marilyn, looked up, and her stern expression softened. Marco, still chasing ambulances? Only the ones carrying crooked developers, he chuckled. This is Ethan Hayes. His grandpa was William Hayes. Owned that big ridge up on the north side of the mountain. Marilyn's eyes lit up with recognition. Oh, I remember William. He used to bring me a jar of his wild honey every fall. A true gentleman. What can I do for you, Mr. Hayes? We need to see the original grant deed for his property, Marco said, his tone shifting back to business. The most recent one, filed about 3 months ago, transferring from William Hayes to a corporation called Apex Mountain Holdings. Marilyn typed into her computer, her fingers flying across the keyboard. A frown creased her forehead. "That's odd," she murmured. "The file was accessed and copied just last week. Request came in from a Victoria Sterling. Pull it up for us, Marilyn," Marco said, his voice firm but gentle. "We have cause." She looked at him, then at me, and made a decision. A few more keystrokes and a printer in the back word to life. She retrieved a document and laid it on the counter. It was the original. I stared at my grandpa's supposed signature. It was close, but it was wrong too neat. My grandpa's hands, gnarled from a lifetime of hard work, had a tremor in his later years. His signature was a barely legible scrawl. This was the work of a steady hand trying to imitate a shaky one. "That's not his signature," I said, my voice thick. Marco pointed to the bottom of the page. "Look at this. The notary." He read the name aloud. "Arthur Pendleton." "Marilyn, does that name ring a bell?" Marilyn's eyes widened. "Arthur? Of course. He was a notary for 40 years. He retired 2 years ago and moved to Arizona to live with his daughter. He resigned his commission then. Everything." Marco pressed. "Well, he did report his stamp and logbook stolen out of his car right before he left town," she said, her voice dropping. "There was a police report. He was very upset about it. Said a man's logbook is his whole career." Marco and I looked at each other. A stolen stamp. A retired notary living in another state. A signature forged on a deed filed 2 days after a man's funeral. The pieces weren't just falling into place. They were forming a picture of breathtaking arrogance. "Marilyn," Marco said slowly, "could you pull the police report on that stolen stamp?" She nodded, already turning back to her computer. "And while you're at it, can you cross-reference any other documents filed in the last 2 years using Arthur Pendleton's notary stamp?" A few minutes later, she slid 2 more pieces of paper across the counter. The first was the police report. It detailed the theft of the notary kit from his car, parked outside the diner where he was having his farewell breakfast. The second paper was a list. There were 4 other property transfers, all in the last 6 months, all to shell corporations, and all notarized with the stolen stamp of Arthur Pendleton. And all of them were linked to properties inside Victoria Sterling's ever-expanding HOA territory. It wasn't just my land. She had a system. This was a pattern, a criminal enterprise hiding behind HOA bylaws and forged documents. Marco Bianchi leaned back, a grim, satisfied smile spreading across his face. He looked like a wolf who had just cornered a plump, unsuspecting sheep. He clapped me on the shoulder. "We've got her, Ethan," he said, his voice low and full of promise. "This isn't just stupid. This is felony-grade stupid." Walking out of the recorder's office, the cool mountain air felt different. It wasn't just about getting my land back anymore. This was bigger. Victoria Sterling wasn't just a thief. She was a predator, using forged documents to prey on the recently deceased. That night, I couldn't sleep. I spread the county zoning maps and my grandpa's old surveys across the small table in my motel room. The coffee was bitter and stale, but I drank it anyway. I was in my element now. This was the part of the job I was good at. Not the legal maneuvering, but the nuts and bolts, the tangible, physical world of rules and regulations that governed how things were built. If her paperwork was a fraud, I was willing to bet her construction was, too. People who cut corners on legal documents don't suddenly become meticulous craftsmen when it comes to pouring concrete or running gas lines. Speed is the name of their game. Speed and profit. I spent the next day parked at a scenic overlook a half-mile from the entrance to Sterling Ridge. With a good pair of binoculars, I could see almost everything. I wasn't looking at the cabins as homes. I was looking at them as a building inspector would, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The propane delivery truck made its rounds. I watched them hook up to a massive 1,000-gallon tank tucked behind Victoria's main cabin. From that central tank, a network of smaller lines snaked out to the individual rental units. From my vantage point, I could see long stretches of the copper tubing. It wasn't buried. It was just lying on the surface, tucked behind rocks and under bushes, exposed to the elements, to falling branches, to anyone tripping over it. It was a lazy, cheap, and catastrophically dangerous way to run gas. That was violation number 1. Number 2, I zoomed in on the decks. They were all identical, cantilevered out over the steep slope of the ridge to maximize the view. But I couldn't see any diagonal bracing. Not a single piece. Under a heavy snow load or a windy day, Those decks were little more than wooden diving boards waiting to snap. Number 3. The septic systems. Or rather, the lack thereof. For 20 rental cabins, you'd need a massive, engineered leach field. There would have been extensive excavation, trucks hauling in sand and gravel for weeks. I had been up here right before I left for my out-of-state job. The ridge had been untouched. She'd thrown these things up in less than 6 months. There was no way she'd had time to install a proper septic system for that many units. She was either using holding tanks that would need constant pumping, unlikely for a rental business, or she was dumping gray water straight into the ground on my mountain, polluting the same ground my grandpa had so carefully protected. The anger I felt was a physical thing, a hot knot in my stomach. I called Marco. "I'm going to need a bigger hammer," I told him. I laid out what I'd seen: the gas lines, the decks, the septic. Marco was quiet for a moment. "That's not just a civil liability, Ethan. That's criminal negligence." "You're sure about this?" "Marco," I said, "I've been doing this for 25 years. I know a death trap when I see one. She's got paying customers' families with kids sleeping in those cabins." That was all he needed to hear. He told me to sit tight. He was going to make a call. The call was to District Attorney Samir Joshi. I met him the next morning in Marco's office. Joshi was the opposite of Marco. He was young, impeccably dressed, and quiet. He listened, his dark eyes missing nothing. He looked at the forged deed, the police report on the stolen stamp, and the list of other suspicious transfers. Then he looked at the notes I'd made about the construction violations. He steepled his fingers, his face calm, but I could see a storm brewing behind his eyes. "Mr. Hayes," he said, his voice soft but carrying the weight of his office. "Your expertise is in construction and safety codes, correct?" "Yes, sir," I said. "I know the rule book backwards and forwards." "Good," Joshi said. He turned to Marco. "We can't move on the fraud charges until we have an airtight case. That will take time. But public safety, that is an immediate concern. A clear and present danger." A slow smile spread across Marco's face. He knew where this was going. "We can arrange a multi-departmental site inspection," Joshi continued. "Building, fire, county health. Unannounced. We'll need a warrant, but based on your testimony, Mr. Hayes, I can get one signed by lunchtime. Interior access will be under that warrant. Exterior hazards are visible from common areas." The plan came together quickly. The next morning, a small convoy assembled at the base of the mountain. 2 vehicles from the fire department, including the fire marshal himself, a truck from the county building inspector's office, a sedan from the health department, Marco, DA Joshi, and me in my truck. We drove up the gravel road in a line. This time, there was no fake cop to stop us. We pulled into the main area of Sterling Ridge. A few families were outside enjoying the morning sun. They looked at our official procession with curiosity. Victoria Sterling came out of her main cabin, a coffee mug in her hand. When she saw the official vehicles, the DA, and me, her face froze. The friendly mask of the welcoming host evaporated, replaced by a tight, angry glare. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, marching toward us. DA Joshi stepped forward and handed her the warrant. "Mrs. Sterling, we are here to conduct a safety inspection of these premises." Her eyes blazed. "This is harassment. You have no right." "We have a warrant signed by Judge Ramirez," Joshi said calmly. "I suggest you step aside and let these gentlemen do their jobs." She was trapped. She knew it. The next 4 hours were a whirlwind of methodical destruction for her business. The fire marshal took one look at the exposed gas lines and the overcrowded propane tanks and started writing. The building inspector walked onto the first deck, took a few heavy steps, felt it wobble, and immediately declared all of them unsafe. The man from the health department took water samples and asked to see the septic permits. Victoria, of course, couldn't produce any. It was exactly as I had suspected, worse, even. Inside the cabins, they found improper electrical wiring, unvented heaters, and a dozen other violations. By noon, every single cabin door had a bright red tag slapped onto it, unsafe for human occupancy. The inspectors went from cabin to cabin, politely but firmly telling the guests they had to pack their things and leave immediately. The resort was being shut down. The vacationers were confused and angry. Their mountain getaway had turned into an emergency evacuation. Their money was gone, and Victoria Sterling wasn't offering any refunds. Her cash flow, the lifeblood of her entire operation, was severed in a single morning. As the last rental car, filled with a disgruntled family and their luggage, drove down the road, Victoria stood on her porch, trembling with rage. She locked eyes with me. Her polished composure was completely gone. She was pure, undiluted fury. "You will regret this, Hayes," she screamed, her voice echoing across the now empty development. "I will bury you." I just stood there watching her. I didn't say a word. The red tags on all those doors were my answer. Her weapon was paper and lies. Mine was the truth, written in black and white in the county building code. The weather had been on the edge all day, the sky a bruised purple-gray. As we drove down the mountain, leaving Victoria Sterling fuming amidst her ghost town of red-tagged cabins, the first snowflakes began to fall. Not the gentle, picturesque kind, but big, wet, heavy flakes that splattered against the windshield. The weather report had been clear. A once-in-a-decade mountain blizzard was barreling in. The timing was almost poetic. The evacuation we'd forced wasn't just a financial blow to her. It had probably saved lives. I dropped Marco and D.A. Joshi back in town and headed for my motel. But I couldn't bring myself to go inside. I felt a strange pull, a sense of responsibility. That was my land up there. Even with her ugly cabin scarring it, it was still my land. And a storm like this on the mountain was no joke. I drove back to the base of the ridge and pulled into the same scenic overlook I'd used for my surveillance. From here, I could see the lights of Sterling Ridge. I settled in for a long night. I watched from the overlook, heater on and scanner low. Snow swallowed the road. The ridge went dark, then one hard white beam, a generator at Victoria's cabin. I figured she'd have one for her main cabin, the nerve center of her little empire. But I also knew about generators. If the rest of her construction was this shoddy, her emergency power setup was likely an afterthought, installed by the lowest bidder. I sat there for hours, the truck's heater blasting, the scanner crackling with reports of downed trees and stranded cars. The storm was even worse than predicted. The county had officially closed the pass. No one was going up or down the mountain until it blew over. I felt a grim satisfaction watching the darkness where her profitable business used to be. She was cut off, isolated, stewing in a mess of her own making. But as the night wore on, another feeling started to creep in. A nagging worry. I knew there were still a few people up there. Victoria, probably a skeleton crew of her staff, and maybe, just maybe, some of the renters hadn't been able to get out in time. What if there was a family with a small child? What if their car wouldn't start? The red tags meant the cabins were unsafe, but they were still shelter from a storm that could kill you. My grandpa's voice echoed in my head. He had a simple code. You don't leave people to freeze on the mountain. You just don't. It didn't matter who they were. You helped. I was wrestling with this, staring into the blinding snow, when the scanner crackled to life with a different kind of call. It was a panicked voice, breaking up with static. A woman. Help. Up at Sterling Ridge. My baby can't breathe right. Smell gas. The dispatcher's calm voice cut through. Ma'am, can you repeat your location? The connection is bad. Cabin 7, Sterling Ridge. The power is out. The heater smells funny. Please. The line went dead. Cabin 7. I had seen it. It was one of the smaller units tucked away at the far end of the development. A family, a baby, and a gas leak. In the middle of a blizzard. My decision was made. There was no debate. I put the truck in four-wheel drive. The F-250 was a beast, with heavy-duty tires and enough torque to pull a house. If any vehicle could make it up that road, this was it. The drive was treacherous. The snow was already over a foot deep, and drifts were piling up in the turns. The wind rocked the truck, and visibility was near zero. I drove by instinct, feeling the road more than seeing it. It took me almost an hour to cover a distance that should have taken 10 minutes. When I finally reached the top, it was a scene of chaos and darkness. The generator that had been lighting Victoria's cabin was silent. The only light came from my headlights, cutting through the swirling snow. I found cabin 7. The lights were out. I pounded on the door. A terrified-looking young man opened it. Behind him, a woman was huddled under a blanket, clutching a small child. The air inside was thick with the sickly sweet smell of propane. The generator went out, the man said, his teeth chattering. We tried to light the wall heater, but it just made this awful smell. It's a leak, I said, my voice sharp and commanding. You need to get out. Now. I cracked both doors to bleed the gas before a spark could trap it inside. They didn't argue. I got them into my running truck, the heater blasting. The baby was coughing, a shallow, wheezing sound. They needed to get off this mountain. But first, I had to deal with the gas. A spark, a stray bit of static electricity, could turn this entire section of the ridge into a crater. I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight and my toolkit from the back of the truck. I followed the unburied copper line from the cabin back toward the main supply. The leak was easy to find. A fitting near the cabin had been improperly tightened. The vibration from the wind, or maybe the contracting cold, had been enough to break the seal. It was hissing audibly, pumping raw propane into the air. But the bigger problem was the main tank. It supplied the entire development. I had to shut it down at the source. I found the 1,000-gallon tank behind Victoria's cabin. The shut-off valve was a large, wheel-like handle. I grabbed it and tried to turn. It wouldn't budge. It was frozen solid with a thick layer of ice. This was the moment where panic could set in. But in my line of work, panic gets you killed. I went back to my truck and grabbed a heavy pipe wrench. Using it for leverage, I put all my weight into it. The ice cracked with a sound like a pistol shot. The valve groaned in protest. For a second, I thought the metal itself would shear off. Then, slowly, painfully, it began to turn. I kept going until it was seated tight. The flow of gas was finally cut off. I stood there panting, the freezing air burning my lungs. The immediate danger was over, and as I turned, my flashlight beam cut across a figure standing on the porch of the main cabin, wrapped in an expensive parka. It was Victoria Sterling. Her face, illuminated in the harsh light, was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She wasn't relieved. She wasn't grateful. She was enraged that I, of all people, was the one playing the hero on her stolen land. The storm broke just before dawn, leaving a world of impossible white and silence. The ridge was buried under nearly 3 feet of snow. The air was so cold it felt solid. I had spent the rest of the night in my truck, the engine running, keeping the young family warm. The baby's coughing had subsided, and they were finally asleep in the back seat. I had made a call to Sheriff Brody, letting him know the situation. He said the plows wouldn't reach us until mid-morning at the earliest. We were stuck. As the sun rose, casting a pink and orange glow on the snow-covered peaks, I saw a movement. Victoria Sterling was trudging through the deep snow from her cabin to mine. She was wearing designer snow boots and a look of grim determination. I got out of the truck to meet her, making sure the family inside wasn't disturbed. "We need to talk," she said. There was no preamble, no thank you for shutting off the gas leak that could have blown her and everyone else to kingdom come. Her voice was flat. "All business." "I'm listening," I said, crossing my arms against the cold. "You've made your point, Hayes," she said, her breath pluming in the frigid air. "You crashed my business. You cost me a fortune in refunds and lost bookings. Congratulations, you won the battle." "This isn't a battle, Victoria," I said. "This is you getting caught for breaking the law." She ignored me, her eyes scanning the landscape of her failed resort. The red tags were barely visible under curtains of snow. "This whole situation is a mess," she continued. "A legal fight will take years. It will be expensive for both of us. Lawyers get rich, and we get nothing but headaches. I have a better idea." She was circling like a predator, sizing up its prey. I knew what was coming. When threats and intimidation fail, the next tool in her box would be money. "I'm proposing a business solution," she said, her gaze finally locking with mine. Her eyes were like chips of ice. "One that makes this all go away quietly. No courts, no more trouble." I didn't say anything. I just let her talk. I wanted to see how deep this hole she was digging for herself went. "I'm prepared to offer you a substantial sum of money," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "A very generous amount, enough to set you up for life. All you have to do is sign a new deed, a quitclaim. It relinquishes any and all claim you have to this land. We'll have it properly notarized, backdated if we need to. It will legitimize my ownership, and you walk away a rich man." It was so brazen, so utterly devoid of morality, that I almost laughed. After everything, the forgery, the endangerment, the theft of my family's legacy, she thought she could just buy me off. She thought my principles, my connection to this land, had a price tag. Before I had left the truck, a thought had occurred to me, a hunch. I had discreetly turned on the voice recorder app on my phone and slipped it into the outer pocket of my heavy work coat. It was recording everything. "How much money are we talking about?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. I needed her to say it. I needed her to put the numbers to her crime. She smiled, a thin, predatory curve of her lips. She thought she had me. $500,000, she said. "Cash. In a briefcase, untraceable. You sign the paper, you take the money, and you never come back up this mountain again." I let the silence hang in the air for a moment. $500,000. It was a lot of money, but it was nothing compared to the value of this land. Not just in dollars, but in memories, in sentiment. in everything my grandpa had built. And what about the families you cheated with that stolen notary stamp? I asked. What about the family I had to pull out of that gas-filled cabin last night? Her smile vanished. That's not your concern. That's the cost of doing business. This is about you and me. Do we have a deal? I needed one more thing. I needed her to admit the original crime. Why go to all this trouble, Victoria? I asked, playing dumb. If the first deed was legitimate, why offer me $500,000 for a second one? She let out an exasperated sigh, as if explaining a complex concept to a simple-minded child. The first deed was a necessary business expense, a shortcut. It's become a complication. This new deal, this is clean. It makes the complication go away, permanently. A necessary business expense. She had just admitted to forgery, plain and simple. I had it all. The offer of a bribe, the amount, the admission that the original document was fraudulent. It was more than enough. I looked her straight in the eye. No deal, I said. Her face contorted with disbelief, then rage. What? Don't be a fool, Hayes. Everyone has a price. Not me, I said, and not for this. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and stopped the recording. Then I held it up and pressed play. Her own voice filled the silent, frozen air. $500,000. Cash in a briefcase. The first deed was a necessary business expense. The color drained from her face. The look in her eyes was something I'll never forget. It was the look of a cornered animal, a predator that had suddenly realized it had stepped into a trap it couldn't escape. She stared at the phone, then at me, her mouth opening and closing, but no words coming out. The polished, ruthless businesswoman was gone. In her place was just a common criminal, caught red-handed. The sound of the county snowplow, grinding its way up the mountain road, echoed from the valley below. Help was on the way. And for Victoria Sterling, so was justice. The recording of Victoria's bribery attempt was the key that unlocked everything. When I played it for Marco Bianchi and D.A. Joshi back in town, their reactions were telling. Marco let out a long, low whistle and started grinning like he'd just won the lottery. Joshi, ever the stoic, simply nodded once, a gesture that conveyed more satisfaction than a dozen fist pumps. He said, "That's the ball game." With that recording as leverage, the flimsy dam of Victoria's criminal enterprise didn't just crack, it burst. D.A. Joshi's investigators moved fast. They didn't need to build a case from scratch anymore. They just needed to collect the final, confirming pieces. Their first stop was a retirement community in Arizona. They found Arthur Pendleton, the notary whose stamp had been stolen, tending his rose bushes. He was small and frail, but his memory was sharp. When the investigator showed him a copy of the deed to my land, he shook his head emphatically. He not only confirmed he hadn't signed it, but he also produced his detailed personal logbooks. For his entire 40-year career, he had kept a meticulous day-by-day record of his movements and activities. On the date the deed was supposedly notarized in our county, his log showed he was 3 states away, attending his grandson's college graduation. He had ticket stubs and photos to prove it. His official notary log, the one that had been stolen with his stamp, was still missing, but his personal records were ironclad. He was a man who lived by the book, and his book was about to bury Victoria Sterling. The next piece of the puzzle was the surveyor. Every new development needs a certified survey map filed with the county. The one for Sterling Ridge had been signed and sealed by a local surveyor named Leo Vance. Marco knew of him. Vance had a reputation for being fast and cheap, a guy who would look the other way on minor infractions for the right price. But this was far from minor. Faced with D.A. Joshi's investigators, the evidence of the fraudulent deed, and the threat of losing his professional license and facing prison time for conspiracy to commit fraud, Leo Vance folded like a cheap suit. He sang like a canary. He told them everything. Victoria Sterling had approached him months earlier. She'd paid him $20,000 in cash under the table to rush the survey. She'd pressured him to ignore the fact that the property lines were drawn incorrectly, encroaching on protected state forest land. She'd made him backdate the official filing to make it look like the survey was completed before she started constructing, a clear violation of county regulations. He even had records of the cash payments. He'd been scared, he said, but the money was too good to pass up. Now, faced with the consequences, his self-preservation instinct kicked in hard. He agreed to testify against Victoria in exchange for a plea deal. While the investigators were tying up those loose ends, my friend Kenji Tanaka went to work. Kenji was a guy I'd known for years. He used to be a forensic accountant for the FBI, specializing in bank fraud. Now, He ran his own private consulting firm. I called him and asked him to take a deep dive into Apex Mountain Holdings, the shell corporation Victoria had used to buy my land. What Kinji found was a labyrinth of deceit. Apex Mountain Holdings was one of a dozen shell corporations registered to the same P.O. box. They had no employees, no assets, and no purpose other than to move money and obscure ownership. He traced the funding for the Sterling Ridge development. It wasn't a standard construction loan from a bank. It was a murky mix of private, high-interest loans from out-of-state lenders known for not asking too many questions. Victoria was leveraged to the hilt. The rental income from the cabins wasn't just profit. It was the only thing keeping her entire house of cards from collapsing. By red-tagging the cabins and cutting off her cash flow, we had pushed her into a corner. Her desperate bribery attempt wasn't just arrogance. It was a last-ditch effort to save herself from financial ruin. Kinji also uncovered the other property transfers made using the stolen notary stamp. He connected the dots. Each property belonged to an elderly owner who had recently passed away. Each was absorbed into Victoria's HOA empire through a fraudulent deed. I wasn't her first victim. I was just the first one who had the knowledge and the stubbornness to fight back. Marco compiled everything into a neat, undeniable package. The forged deed, the testimony from the retired notary, the confession from the crooked surveyor, the financial forensics from Kinji showing a clear pattern of criminal activity, the dozens of safety and code violations from the official inspections, and the cherry on top, the crystal-clear audio recording of Victoria Sterling offering me a $500,000 bribe and admitting to the original fraud. Marco called me into his office a week before the court date. The file on his desk was 6 inches thick. "The judge has reviewed the preliminary filings," he said, leaning back in his creaky chair. He looked tired but deeply satisfied, like a man who had just finished a marathon. "DA Joshi is filing a motion for summary judgment on your quiet title action. That means we're asking the judge to rule in our favor without even needing a full trial because their case has no merit. They have nothing, Ethan. No evidence, no witnesses, no leg to stand on. So it's over?" I asked. "The civil case is," Marco said with a nod. "She'll lose the land, and we're going after her for every penny she made off it, plus damages. But the criminal case, that's just getting started." He tapped the thick file on his desk. "Joshi is going to the grand jury next week. He's not just charging her with forgery and bribery. He's adding racketeering to the list. This wasn't a one-time crime. This was an ongoing criminal enterprise." He paused, then gave me a hard look. "You did good, Ethan. You didn't just get your land back. You took down a whole damn empire." He picked up the phone on his desk. "The judge has set the date for the hearing on our motion," he said, a wide grin spreading across his face. "It's over before it even begins." The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with old wooden benches that creaked every time someone moved. It felt solemn, a place where consequences were handed out. Victoria Sterling was already there, sitting at the defendant's table with a lawyer who looked like he cost more per hour than my truck. She was dressed in a severe gray suit, her blonde hair pulled back in a tight, professional bun. She was trying to project an image of power and control, but I could see the cracks. There was a faint tremor in her hands, and her eyes, when they accidentally met mine, were filled with a venomous hatred. She wasn't the confident predator I had met on the mountain road. She was a defendant, stripped of her power, about to face the machinery of the law she thought she could manipulate. I sat with Marco at the plaintiff's table. DA Joshi was there, too, seated just behind us. He gave me a quiet, reassuring nod. The room was quiet except for the rustling of papers. The judge entered, a stern-looking woman in her late 60s named Judge Helen Ramirez. The bailiff called the court to order. Judge Ramirez had a reputation for being sharp, impatient, and having zero tolerance for games. She looked over the top of her glasses at the lawyers. "I have read the motion for summary judgment filed by Mr. Bianchi and the response from the defendant," she said, her voice crisp and clear. "Frankly, I'm amazed we're even here. The evidence presented by the plaintiff is overwhelming." Victoria's expensive lawyer stood up. "Your Honor, we contend that there are matters of fact that can only be resolved by a full trial." Judge Ramirez cut him off with a sharp wave of her hand. "What matters of fact? The fact that the deed was notarized by a man who was 1,000 miles away at the time? The fact that the surveyor who signed off on your client's development has already confessed to fraud and conspiracy? Or the fact that your client was recorded on tape, admitting to the crime and attempting to bribe the rightful owner of the property?" The lawyer paled. He stammered, "Your Honor, that recording was obtained without my client's consent. This is a one-party consent state, Counselor," the judge snapped back. Mr. Hayes was a party to the conversation. "The recording is admissible. Do you have anything else? Or are you just going to stand there and waste the court's time?" The lawyer, defeated, slowly sat down. Judge Ramirez turned her attention to me and Marco. "Mr. Bianchi, your motion for a quiet title action is granted. The fraudulent deed is hereby nullified. Title to the parcel of land in question is immediately and fully restored to your client, Mr. Ethan Hayes." A wave of relief washed over me, so powerful it almost buckled my knees. It was real. I had my land back, but the judge wasn't finished. She looked back at Victoria Sterling, and her expression was pure ice. "Furthermore," she continued, "the court finds that the defendant, Victoria Sterling, and her corporation, Apex Mountain Holdings, have been unjustly enriched through their illegal occupation and commercial use of Mr. Hayes's property. I am ordering a full disgorgement of all profits, revenues, and rents collected, every single dollar." She wasn't done. "In addition, I am ordering the defendant to pay for the full costs of removing the illegally constructed cabins and restoring the land to its original state. A trust will be established, managed by Mr. Hayes, to oversee this work." Victoria's face, which had been pale, was now ashen. This wasn't just a loss. It was a total annihilation of her finances. Every penny she had stolen was being clawed back. Then, Judge Ramirez looked toward D.A. Joshi. "Mr. Joshi," she said, "the civil matter is concluded. The floor is yours." Joshi stood. He didn't raise his voice. He spoke in the same quiet, methodical tone he always used, but his words landed like hammer blows. "Your Honor, based on the evidence uncovered during this civil dispute, the grand jury has returned a true bill. The district attorney's office is formally charging Victoria Sterling on multiple felony counts." He listed them off one by one. 1 count of property fraud, 1 count of forgery, 1 count of bribery of a witness, 4 counts of felony reckless endangerment related to the construction of the unsafe dwellings, and 1 count under the state's Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act for engaging in a pattern of criminal activity. With each charge, Victoria seemed to shrink in her chair. The mask of composure shattered completely. This was no longer about money or land. This was about her freedom. Her high-priced lawyer was frantically whispering to her, but she didn't seem to hear him. She just stared blankly ahead, her perfect world collapsing in on her in a hushed, sterile courtroom. Given the severity of these charges and the defendant's demonstrated willingness to subvert the legal process, Joshi concluded, the state requests that she be remanded into custody immediately, pending a bail hearing. Judge Ramirez nodded. "The request is granted." She looked at the 2 bailiffs standing by the wall. "Take the defendant into custody." The bailiffs moved forward. One of them pulled out a pair of handcuffs. Victoria Sterling finally broke. A choked sob escaped her lips. "No," she whispered. "You can't." The bailiff gently but firmly pulled her hands behind her back. The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs locking echoed through the silent courtroom. It was a small sound, but it was the sound of finality, the sound of justice. As they led her away, her polished facade was gone, replaced by the raw, unvarnished face of a criminal who had finally been caught. She was no longer the queen of a mountain. She was just another inmate in an orange jumpsuit, her empire of lies and greed reduced to nothing. The snow was finally melting. It was late spring, a few months after the courtroom showdown. I stood on the ridge, on the exact spot where that fake cop had tried to turn me away. The air was clean and cold, carrying the scent of pine and thawing earth. It smelled like home. The silence was the most noticeable thing. The constant hum of construction, the rumble of trucks, the noise of vacationers, it was all gone. The only sounds were the wind in the trees and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Below me, a demolition crew was at work. They were a good crew, one I'd worked with before. They were carefully dismantling the last of Victoria Sterling's ugly cabins. They weren't just knocking them down. They were taking them apart piece by piece, sorting the materials for recycling, minimizing the impact on the land. The cost of the entire operation was being paid for by the funds seized from Victoria's accounts, the same funds she had made from her illegal rentals. Marco Bianchi came and stood beside me. He held out a thick envelope. "The last of it," he said. I opened it. Inside was the new, clean deed to my land, officially recorded and stamped by Marilyn at the county office. There was also a cashier's check for the first payment from the restitution fund. The money Victoria was ordered to pay back to the other families whose land she had stolen. DA Joshi used my case as the blueprint to unravel Victoria's network. For more families got their land back. Holding the deed felt different now. It wasn't just something I'd inherited. It was something I'd fought for, earned. What happened with her? I asked, though I knew most of it. She took a plea, Marco said, hands in his pockets. Racketeering scared her. She pled to fraud and bribery. 5 to 7, state time. Assets seized for restitution and fines. She's broke. I nodded, looking over the valley. No joy in it, just finality. A problem found, a problem fixed. And the surveyor? License gone. 2 years probation for cooperating, Marco said. Gary got a fine and community service. Lucky that family didn't sue. We stood in easy silence, watching the crew work. The ridge still showed scars. The raw cuts where cabins sat. The useless roads pushed through the trees. It would take years to heal, but it would heal. The restitution money was enough to do it right. Replant native pines, restore the old drainage, pull up the dead roads, and let the mountain breathe again. That was the new project, building by unbuilding. I'd already met with a forestry consultant. Different tools, same goal, sound structure. Uncle Walt had come up the week before. He walked the slope slow, boots crunching in the duff, then put a heavy hand on my shoulder. Your grandpa would be proud, Ethan. He always said this ridge needed a fighter. He was right. At sunset, the peaks went copper, then bruised purple. I thought about the one question that had carried me. How far will a man go to defend his own? As far as he must. Not with rage or fists, but with what he knows. You fight with facts, with building code and notary logs, with maps, dates, and names that don't move. You outlast the lie. You keep your footing when the ground tilts. Victoria Sterling tried to win with pressure and paper. In the end, her empire fell to a stolen stamp, a hissing gas line, and one simple rule: don't back down. The last wall of the last cabin came apart with a clean crack and a sigh, and the valley opened up like it always had. The ridge went quiet, mine again. The hard work was done. The good work, the healing, was starting. I stood there a long time, listening to the wind in the pines, the small sounds of the crew packing up their tools, and felt something settle inside me. Not triumph, not spite, peace.